In our last video, we learned how to draw a trout, and I told you guys to practice that out, but how do you get your sketch onto watercolor paper? Watercolor paper is really thick, so you can't just lay it over there and hope to see the sketch in between. So here's a trick. It's to use a transfer paper. That's a kind of paper that has a graphite underneath it, and as you push down on this, it transfers onto what's underneath it. But what if you don't have transfer paper? You can make this sketch into your own transfer paper. So you can see on the back side of my drawing, I'm taking a really soft leaded graphite pencil, and I am just scribbling really densely on the opposite side of where my fish is. I want a lot of graphite on this paper. So much that if I run my finger, you should see a little bit of that graphite on my finger. Make sure that the whole area of the fish is covered on the back. Now lay down your watercolor paper and position your fish over top of it, right where you'd want it to be. With one hand, I'm going to hold this paper down really firmly in a couple of points so that it doesn't twist or move. And with my other hand, I'm left-handed, so I'm going to use my left hand, I'm going to trace over my fish lines. And I'm going to use not a super hard pressure, but a pretty firm pressure. Because you'll see, as I'm doing that, it's transferring over. I don't want to score the image into the paper underneath. But I definitely want to get that graphite all the way in. Now it's really important that this paper doesn't shift until I have everything that I want. I can peel this back as long as I'm not moving the paper. See, this hand is still holding it down. I can pull this back a little bit and just double check that everything has transferred and I can see the image. Once that's done, I can move on to painting. So as you can see, I have my nice sketch of my fish here, and we're going to start painting in the colors. And one thing we're tempted to do is just to jump in with some nice, deep, rich colors, but we're not going to. We're going to start building our colors up slowly with watercolor using what we call a gradient. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wake up some of my palettes. So I'm going to start in here. I'm going to go with this nice kind of purple. Got some clean water over here, and I'm just going to put some water in here just to wake that up, and you'll see the paint beginning to swirl. I don't need a lot of it, but I just want to get it a little wet so that when I need it, it's there for me. Now before I even take this paint and put it onto my paper, I'm going to add what we call a wash, and I'm going to use just clean water for that. So here's my jar of clean water. I'm just going to rinse my brush out of any pigment, and I'm going to take and lay in some water right on the inside of the fish. Your watercolor paint is going to go anywhere you have water. If your paper is dry, your paint's not going to travel there unless you have your paper tilted up and then gravity kind of pulls the drips down. But if you have your paper nice and flat, it's just going to stay. So I'm going to give a nice wash over the lower half of my fish. I'm not going to worry about going into the fins. I'm just wetting down the main body of the fish. I'm going to go around his eye because I don't need any paint to go in there yet. Now with watercolor, you have to work kind of fast. Not super fast, but you don't want this to dry on you and then you have to redo it again. So I'm going to go back to my palette. Now that my paint is woken up, I'm just going to take just a little bit. If you need to, you can take and test it out on a blank piece of paper, and you can see that it's very little pigment. Just a little bit of paint mixed with water. I want a very light pigment. If you go in there and you paint a swatch and it just is totally purple, it's too dark. We're wanting to create a bit of a cast shadow along here. So I'm just going to tap in my paint so you can barely see it on camera. Now see, if I put too much paint in there, see how that's too much pigment. I'm just going to rinse my brush off. Just dab a little bit of it off and I can swirl that around and spread that paint over a little bit. Kind of think of it as sweeping your floors, only you're sweeping the color around. This is going to give us an undertone of a nice shadow and help us as we begin to apply in a little bit darker colors. Art is a lot about art is taking your time. That's one thing I often tell a lot of my students when they're struggling with something is I think they're rushing it. Just take a deep breath and tell yourself you don't have to have this finished in 5 minutes. You don't have to have it finished in an hour or even in a day. You can take it just as slowly as you want, putting in the time that you need. Once this part is done, I'm going to let it set for a minute and we're going to move on to our next colors. Clean off a little spot here. I love white plastic palettes because you can really see what the color is going to look like when you lay it on the paper. But there I have a nice little clean area. So I need an olive green, and I don't have an olive green in any of my colors because it's pretty easy to mix up. I'm going to start over here with a nice little green. I'm going to wake that paint up. All right, I'm going to move that green. I'm going to tone it down a little bit. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to pull in just a little bit of my brown, and you'll see as I begin to add that how it just tones it down. I'm going to go nice and slow. You can always add more brown. But you see how now that's turning into a nice olive green. I don't want to turn it into like a poop brown, but I want a nice olivey green. There we go. All right, for this next step, I'm going to start off right here at the very top edge of my fish. And if it helps you, go ahead and tilt your paper if you need to, whatever's most comfortable for your wrist. Again, I'm left-handed, so I kind of tilt the opposite way. And I'm going to get a nice point to my brush, and I'm going to start right on that edge and paint along down the backbone of my fish. Now you'll see it kept a really crisp line because this paper here is dry. Remember this one, when I added it here, it just kind of whooshed because it was a wet. So this is a wet on dry technique, where this was a wet on wet technique, meaning that the paint had a lot of water and the paper had a lot of water. Where this, the wet on dry technique, is a really wet paint but on dry paper. But I don't want this harsh line. So I'm going to rinse my brush off. And I'm just going to tap off a little bit of the excess water. I want this brush to still be really loaded with water, so you can see it's really juicy. And I'm going to bring my brush, I'm going to stay on this bottom line of the paint and keep my tip right in the paint, but the brush on the paper. And as you can see, as I'm going across here, it's wetting the paper and encouraging the paint to travel down. So now I've taken out that harsh line. So I'm going to clean my brush again, and I'm going to keep going down along here till I get just the right flow. Now if I think I've lightened my paper up too much, I can go back in with my darker paint and drop some of that down. You'll see that now it's beginning to spread because the paper is nice and wet. And I'm going to protect the middle part of my fish because this is where we're going to put that beautiful kind of pinkish red color for our rainbow trout. I want to lighten this line up, so I'm going to rinse my brush off and I'm going to dry it off pretty well. So it's not, if I squeeze it, water is not going to come out. And this is going to lift up my paint. So I'm going to take and run my brush along this, and you'll see it just lifts up paint. So I can take a little tissue here and I'll wipe off that paint, and you'll see that's the excess paint down there that I don't need anymore. There we go. Now while this is still wet, it's not drippy wet, but the paper is still wet, I'm going to come in and start adding in my pink in here. So I'm going to go over here to this this is a nice warm red color, and I'm going to actually put it over here. It's not quite clean, but it's the same tone. I'm going to get this nice and loose. I don't want a thick concentration of paint. I'm going to load my brush up, and then right in the center here, I'm going to go and draw in my pink line right up to where the gills are. Sometimes if you just dab your paintbrush onto your paper, your paints will kind of spread out a little bit. I'm going to rinse my brush off, dry it off so that it's not super juicy, just damp. And then I'm going to sweep just lightly, like you're touching a butterfly wing. You don't want to push or pull too much. And again, I'm taking and wiping off any excess paint, but I want the green and the pink to play a little bit so they're not super harsh. So I'm just kind of tapping and then wiping off excess paint. And the more you do this, the more your painter's instincts will kick in, and you'll know exactly when to wipe that paint off and when not to. This is just all about building up your instincts. And the only way to do it is just to do it. Just keep painting and practicing and allowing yourself mistakes and allowing yourself to learn. It's all about a process. Now I do want to take some of this olive green and add a little bit of that underneath our kind of a rosy color. So I'm going to put the paint right on my brush, and I'm just going to run it right under here. Don't have to worry too much about that side fin. Clean off my brush, dry it off, and then I'm going to pull that down to the bottom of my fish. The more water you have on your paper, the faster your paints are going to travel. So again, that's another trial and error that you're just going to begin to learn as you practice what your water level content needs to be. So here I want to be able to see that it's definitely not dry, but I don't want to see it shiny. If I look with the light reflecting, it's kind of a foggy wet. So then I know that's a pretty good wetness for my paint. So we're going to let this set for a little bit, and we're going to focus a little bit more on his fins and maybe a little bit on his face. So something to remember is that if this up here is really wet and you start painting here, the paint you put here, if it comes in contact with wet paper, is going to bleed down in. So you might want to let this set and let it dry for a little bit, because you want a nice crisp line between these 2 points. This is going to be a different color than this up here. So go ahead and pause the video if you need to give your paper a moment or two to dry. But while we're waiting, we're going to go ahead and mix up our paints, which I think, again, I'm going to have to clean off some spots on my palette so we have a clean working area. I love looking at my palettes because I can tell what I was painting before by the color schemes that I was working with. It's always kind of fun to go, oh, that was my painting. So if you guys want to share with me what art you're working on, make sure to use the hashtag #CamArtAtHome. Tag the Coos Art Museum in your posts so I can see what everyone's working on. Okay, I have a nice clean little area. And for this one, I want a brownish green. So for here, we wanted a green that was a little bit brown. Now I want a brown that's just a little bit of green. So I'm going to get some water here, and I'm going to pull in some of my brown right here. And then I'm going to take a little bit of this green here, and I'm just going to dab it over. We don't need much, just a little bit. And I'm all about using up what paints I have. So I want to add just a little bit of yellow in here. Mixing colors is so much fun to learn how to do. Again, I mean, there's definite rules to it. If you mix yellow and red together, you're going to get an orange. But how much of each really changes the tone that you get. I love mixing my own colors. The only problem with it is make sure you mix enough, because if you don't mix enough, then you need that exact same color. It can be challenging to mix that back up. So here I have my brown that has a little bit of green in it. And my fish should be pretty well dry. I'm going to start with this back fin because it seems like it's probably the driest. And I'm just going to go ahead and lay this color in wet on dry. Now, the point of your paintbrush is really important. If I paint it off the side, I'm going to get this kind of a really good texture line, but I can't get that detail. So if your paintbrush has this nice point to it, you can really get into those fine details and not even have to switch to a thin line brush. There we go. Nice little fishy tail. And before my paint dries, I need to paint all the rest of these fins. So I'm not going to stop to chat too much because we got some painting to get done before my paint dries. Because you can always add more water, but that's also going to lighten the pigment up. And it's going to change my color. So I'm going to try to avoid doing that. Now this fin actually connects into the fish. We'll come back and talk about that in a second. Some of these fins have a distinct line of color. Especially like this top one here, where it connects into the top of the fish. And this one up here. You get into painting, you kind of get into that zone. It's hard to remember to talk, or people talking to you, it's hard to listen. I'm going to flip my paper around just so it's easier to get the angle I want on my hand. You'll find some directional lines are easier to do than others. So for me, going this way is much easier than trying to go this way. So flip that paper around. So again, if my fish was wet when I did this and I put this, my fin color would go whoosh, and I wouldn't get this nice crisp line. So since it's dry, it's holding its own fairly well. It's keeping itself nice and distinct. But I don't want a harsh line where the fin connects into the fish, so I'm just going to clean my brush off with some water. Whack the camera with my paintbrush. There we go. And I'm just going to tap off some of that color so it kind of blends in. Same thing over here. I'm just going to tap, and my little tiny, I got the tiniest little piece of paper towel. Conservation, I guess. See how it's lifting that paint out of there? So this paint has already started to dry and set. So instead of spreading, it's lifting that color. So I'm going to go back in and pull in some of that color and just tap it back in. This is okay because this is still just, you know, the first couple washes that we've done. All right, so we have our fins colored in. Let's go ahead and begin adding in some texture right up here at the top because this is pretty dry now. All right, so I'm going to move back to my palette, which is pretty well. I've used up my paints pretty well, so let's just kind of clean that up a little bit. So I want to go back in and get a greenish brown that we had before, but I want to add a little bit more of a reddish brown to it. So I'm going to take this brown over here. It's a little bit reddier. There you go. Look at that nice color. Oh, so nice. I might pull in a few of my darker greens just to darken that up a little bit. And when you have the color that you like, I mean, you guys can paint your fish whatever color you want. That's the fun of being an artist, is you could have a purple fish, I don't care. But once you have the color you want, we're going to start adding this in. Now I'm starting to build up textures, so I am not wetting the paper, so this is a wet on dry, and I'm not swiping my paintbrush. Let me zoom in so you can see a little bit. I'm just going to start tapping my brush. So I'm going to start creating a pattern on the top of that fish using the very, very top point of my paintbrush. Just tap that down around by the gills, around by the eye, but I'm not going to go underneath. Remember to double check your reference photos, especially if you're wanting to kind of keep things a little bit more lifelike. Look at those reference photos to see what do the patterns look like. I'm going to start bringing this pattern down along the back. I don't want my pattern to be exactly the same, so I'm not just going to go dot, 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 dot. I don't want like a uniform pattern. I want it to be a little bit different, so it's kind of more like just squiggling my brush around. I'm going to lessen the amount of paint on my brush as I come down here a little bit, so it's not such a bold color. So I'm wiping off the excess paint off my brush just to kind of give that a nice fogged out look. So I have a little bit of this paint left, and I want to add a little bit more of that brown. So I'm going to come over here back to my redder brown. I'm going to pull in some of this orange over here. I'm going to dabble that in there because I don't want to darken it. I just want to kind of bring up some different tones of green, playing around with that. And I'm just going to keep on tapping in some fun colors along his head. You'll notice that the paint's not going into his eyes. That's because I've not added any water in there. And I'm going to even bring up a little bit underneath his bottom jaw. But I'm going to keep that lip a little bit lighter in tone. Now he's looking a little dark. I want to lighten him up, so I'm going to clean my brush off really good. Dry it off so it's not drippy wet. And you'll see that when I touch the wet paint, the paint is going to travel to whatever is driest, as long as it's not bone dry. So if my paintbrush has less water in it, the paint travels up the paintbrush. But if my paintbrush was wetter and the paper was a little less wet, it would travel down the paintbrush onto my paper. Now I want to add some color to his eye, but I'm going to wait, because if I do, because this is wet here, it's going to travel all in there. So we'll wait a little moment. Let's work on some more definition with his tail back here. So I have a little bit of this color left. I'm going to mix that in there. I'm going to rotate my paper so that I can get right here up in the corner, and I'm just going to kind of paint along the edge of his fin and then flick my brush inward, and that's going to create some of those textures for that fin. I'm going to come in some really dark color. I just picked up just the straight brown, because now that that's wet, as I tap it, you can see the paint just is doing most of the work for me. It's traveling exactly up those lines. I might just do a little encouraging if it's not quite wet enough to do that, but you get some good nice texture. What you don't want to do is just put a solid line across here. You want to protect your lighter colors in the drier areas so that you have that nice contrast. Also, don't worry about this being a super tight line. It's okay if there's a little bit of jags and rips and tears in the fishtail. Gives him a little history. That's looking nice. Let's do the same thing over here. I'm not even going to clean my brush off. I'm just going to go in with the paint I have. Same technique, I'm just wetting this area down here and then just flicking my brush, really light pressure, so I'm getting a really thin line. I'm going to go in with some nice dark paint. And then just flick, flick, flick. Again, I'm not trying to go with a uniform shape or anything like that. I want it to look all nice and natural. Now a trick with color or adding adding your highlights and your shadows is that when you darken something, it oftentimes helps the appearance of pushing things away. So I want to push this fin back. So while this is still a little bit wet, I'm going to clean my brush off and I'm just going to add a little bit of water right down here. I'm going to grab my darker tone. I'm going to add this along here, clean my brush off, and then I'm going to flick this up. I'm just going to add a little bit of a shadow. And kind of push things back a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit of orange into that. Play around with colors. Just if it looks a little bit muddied up and you want some fresh color, don't be afraid to let it dry and go back in with another wash, see if you can lighten that up. So I was just looking at a little blob, so adding a little bit of yellow orange into that. It's going to add some interest. All right, back to our fins. So this one here, I just want to create a couple lines coming down from the edge and then darken down here. So I'm going to place my paint, but you'll see I leave a little edge. That's going to help give an impression that it's a little bit tougher there, a little spine. And I try to keep my hand out of the way so you guys can see what I'm doing. It's always helpful when I'm showing you something and all you can see is my knuckle. All right, so I'm going to let that rest, looking pretty good. And let's go ahead and move over to his eye. So I'm going to add in an undertone first, and I'm going to pick in a nice yellow. And I'm just going to fill in his whole eye with this yellow. Again, you're going to want to make sure that your fish is nice and dry. Otherwise, your yellow is just going to spread like the dickens. I'm going to tap off just a little excess because that's going to take a long time to dry. That was a lot of paint. I want some definite nice color in here. Fish have such cool eyes. So that definitely is going to need to dry for a little bit. So let's move on to another part of our fish. Let's move over to his gills. And for his gills, I want to start putting in just a little bit of hint of that pink around the gills. So again, I'm going to go back over here to where I had that pink. Just wake it back up again. I'm going to get it nice on my brush, and then I'm just going to swash that down. Really dry. So I'm going to clean my brush off. And it's clean, but not super dry. And again, taking my little towel, I'm just going to kind of soften the edges. I wanted that nice bold color, but I'm softening it. And I'm leaving that nice ridge right around here around this gill, because I want to have a nice contrast, have another little contrast right there. We're going to add some texture going on into the side of this fish. So for this, we're going to go back in here, and I'm going to create a kind of a bluish gray color. So I'm going to wet my area down so that my paints kind of flow out. I'm going to take some blue here just a little bit, just to kind of give it a little hue. And I'm going to take a little bit of this purple, not a lot. I don't want it to be bluish. I want it to be a nice blue-gray. So just like that. So it's not super dark at all. And I'm going to come along here and I'm going to create these little rectangle shapes, little squares. I'm laying my color down. I'm not going to soften it right away. What I'm doing is I'm giving the paper time to absorb some of that pigment before I soften it. Again, you want to make sure that your fins are nice and dry, otherwise your fins are going to flood right into there. But once it's set there, I don't know, 30 seconds, I'm going to have a clean brush that I've kind of dried off so it's not drippy, and I'm going to go around the edges and just pick up that paint. And once I got some paint, I'm going to wipe it off on my tissue. So I don't want super harsh lines, but I definitely want some nice patterning to go there. Just a nice little patterning on that fish. I want to try to keep that color in the center, but just soften those edges. So you see, as I'm doing this, I'm just wiping just like this. Every time that paintbrush goes off screen, that's what I'm doing. I'm just dabbing off any excess paint. It's just going to give us something to look at. That's why it's really important not to do this step before you lay these base colors in there. Because if I did this step and I thought, oh, well, I want to add my pink in there, adding that wash is going to mess up this patterning. It would mess up this patterning if I added that wash of green. So you want to get your undertones down in there first before you start messing with things. Then it causes a lot more work. Now that doesn't mean that I can't go back and add. In fact, I want to add a little bit more red into this. So I'm going to go in with some nice magenta, nice little pink in here. I'm just going to tap that in because I want some textures in here as well. And it's fun to take a brave notion, just say, hey, what would happen if I did this? Now, I'm not going for a smooth gradient. I want some texture, so that's why I'm doing that now. And because this is wet, I want that to run into that kind of shadowed area there. You can see there's a small part of my fin that was not dry. And you can see that paint is traveling back up there. That happens, don't worry about it, just let it sit for a little bit. And then with a clean brush, you can kind of go back in and smooth that out. I'm going to try to remove water instead of adding water. So just keep on wiping your brush off. All right, so we have this. We're waiting for this eye to dry a little bit. It's taking some time. So if you're in a hurry and you want something to dry, you can always take a little hair dryer and you can blow dry it. So I'm going to do that too, so we don't have to sit here for half an hour waiting for my eyeball to dry. Add a little bit of this dark black over here, brown over here. So I get this nice color. If it's too brown for you, you can add a little blue into it. Sometimes if we just go right in with just inky store-bought black, it can kind of deaden your picture. So I find I like to mix my own blacks, but if you don't want to, you can definitely use your regular blacks. I'll use regular black, store-bought black for more illustrated pictures, but if I'm trying to go natural, I find mixing them works a lot better. So the first thing I do, and again, make sure your eye is dry, otherwise you're gonna have a black eye. Well, you won't have a black eye, your fish will have a black eye. Oh no! So I'm gonna put in his pupil. Remember to stay on the very tip of your paintbrush so you can get a nice controlled line. And then, again, looking at reference photos, they just have a very unique little pattern. So I want to make sure I keep that rim around the center of his pupil, but then just kind of add a little bit of color on either side like that. Whew, that was fun. A little bit of texture over here. So I'm going to take a lot less paint, a little bit more water. I'm just going to tap in right there. That's some controlling your lines. All right, we'll let that dry before we move on. And I'm gonna work on adding some shadows and kind of contouring out what's going on in his gills. So for that, I'm gonna mix up some of my dark green brown again. And I'm just gonna start tapping in some shadows right in here. I do not want to touch that eye. I want a nice little ridge around that so it looks like the eye socket. Again, I don't want a solid swipe. I want to keep those nice textures we work so hard to get. Pull in some lines here because it's going to pop that lip up if I darken that underneath there a little bit. I want to darken in some of these gills areas. Keep on darkening up our colors, slowly but surely. Not getting rid of everything, but just slow and steady. I feel I'm getting too green, so I'm going to go in with some orange. Mix a little orange with my brown. Because my reference photos are just showing that they're a little rustier on top. I kind of have them a frog green, and I want them to be more of a toad green. And it's fun to have different colors, not all the same. So what's fun about watercolors is they just like to blend and mesh together. It's turning out to be a much more detailed video than I was first intending, but hey, when you get having fun painting, it's fun to kind of chat about your process. What's also fun is the process that I take can be completely different to another artist. We have several watercolor artists at the Coos Art Museum, and each of them tackle painting just a little bit differently. Does it make one right and one wrong? Nope. Because art is how you create it. Art is a process of how you create something. Cause and effect. So if by doing it one way you're getting the effect that you want, then go for it. But definitely be open to listening to how other artists create, because you might just find a method that you like a little bit more. Can't wait for it when we can open back up and we have all of our classes going again, just to be able to show you guys some different ways of doing things. So I'm going to take this texture detail that I've been doing here, and I'm going to run this down along his back. So I'm going to speed the video up a little bit because, I don't know, it might be getting a little boring for you. So if you need to pause it to do yours before we go on to the next step, feel free to do that. But I'm just going to, it's just the same thing, but I don't want to bore you with my non-ending rambles. So a couple of different things that I did. Again, I took my color all the way down here, and then I worked a little bit more on the gills. Looking at my reference photos, I kind of wanted to really define that there wasn't just one gill. There's a lot of bits and bobs going on there. I'm not going to try to get technical because I don't know the names, but definitely check your reference photos out to help you get those details in there. I added a little cast shadow using that more concentrated grayish blue color that we've been using right behind here, this fin, just to pop this out a little bit, and then pop this one down here out a little bit more. And that's when I decided that my fins needed a little bit of brightening up, so I went back in and added a little bit of orange over top of them just to kind of wake them back up again, because they were looking a little on the dull side. And this fish is so beautifully colored, I didn't want to lose out on that. So you might think we're done, but we are not. We have a really fun and brave step coming up, but this fish needs to be completely dry. Another thing you need to do before you dry it is to just double check that the base color is what you want, because after this next step, it's going to be really hard to go in and darken in washes. Like we did this part here where we're able to go back in and darken in the red along the fish. With the next part, it's going to be challenging because we're going to be adding a really nice stippling pattern effect, and it's not going to want to be washed around too much more after that. So fix your fish, make sure it's the way you like it, make sure he's nice and dry, and then we'll start on with the final bits of steps, which is adding those great details. All right, everything is nice and dry. We're going to come in with a really dark brownish black. So I got this one right here. I'm going to wake it up. We're just going to use this as is. We're not going to mix it, so I'm just going to keep it in its in the well. All right. So with a thinner brush, it doesn't have to be an liner brush, we're going to start adding in the dots, the really dark textures. And I'm just going to tap it. You're not wanting the same shape, and you don't want it to be, you know, in a perfect row. But there's a little bit of a pattern to each fish. So again, reference photos are best friends. Some blotches are a little bit bigger than others. This can be scary because at this point we can ruin our drawing. And you know what? If your drawing or painting gets ruined, it's okay, because what we learned by creating this has value. And when we mess up something, we learn more from our mistakes, I think, than we do our successes. So yeah, messing up is not a bad thing. So I don't want just to make him look like a Dalmatian fish. So you'll see that there are some areas that are a little less speckled. There are some smaller speckles. However you want to go. And now we're going to start bringing this along his back. They really are just beautiful fish. Remember, don't get too patterny. If you need to, step back from your drawing, rotate it upside down just so that you're not seeing it the exact same way all the time. Can really help you go, oh, I need a dot there, or see some of your mistakes. I find holding it up to a mirror and looking at that way can really be very helpful. So some of my dots I'm having really concentrated paints. As they move down, I'm going to have them be a little bit lighter in concentration. So when I first dip my paint into the paintbrush, you'll see I'll paint these dark ones up here. But then after I lose a little bit of that paint and I have more water and they're looking a little bit more lighter, then I might add some down here. This is not a point in your drawing to rush. You might think, oh, it's just dotting. Just hurry up and dot it and get it done. Nope, this is the part where you just really think about, do I want a dot there? Now you'll find that the dots really stay towards the top half of the fish. So I'm not going to put very many dots down here. I don't think, for the most part, it seems to stay on the upper top part of the fish. While I have this color, I might define out my eye a little bit more, just to give it a little bit more definition. So let me go ahead and fill in the rest of this fish body. So you'll see I took the spots all the way down around here. I kind of concentrated a little bit more down here, and then I began to sparse them out a little bit underneath the kind of red area. So there's not a lot right smack dab in the middle, but a little bit here, and then the belly area is relatively free of any kind of spots. So the only place I want to add some spots are on the rest of the fins. So I'm going to do that, and then our spotting time will be just about done. So there is our little fish. We can make him look, look, if you warp your paper around, it looks like it's really swimming. What? He's a painting. But we're not quite done yet. There's a couple other things you can do. But for these, you're either going to need an opaque paint, like a white gouache. You can use like a white acrylic, or you can use just a white gel pen. Again, you're going to want this to be completely dry, but we're going to add some highlights to his little scales. So for these, you're going to want a super thin brush if you're going to be using inks or paint. If you have a gel pen, of course, you can be as thin as that gel pen will let you. I'm going to try this out first with some of these. I'm going to try it out with this ink here first. I haven't experienced that this is super opaque, but we'll give it a shot. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through here and just the very tiniest dabs. You don't want polka dots, you want shine marks. I'm just gonna start just tapping some places that might need a little extra highlight. I'm gonna definitely put a little spot right on his eye to kind of give a shine there. Kind of like what we did with the spots, but with this one we're thinking of a highlight. So as the fish's body kind of bends around, we're gonna kind of go with where that curve would be and just hit it. So we're not bringing it all the way down, we're just dabbing. All right, I'm going to put in a little bit, and if you flick your brush, you'll get a thinner line. So I'm going to go right on those little ribs and just kind of put a little extra highlight on those. Sometimes you might get a little bit of a line, so you can just kind of tap that up with your finger a little bit, or just kind of lighten it so it's not so in your face. So with this, I'm just going to go over kind of this rosy area with some slashing lines here. I just want to give just some little texture, maybe a little bit of indication of some scale patterns. Nothing that I just really want wham bam to see, just hints of some texture. Anywhere else that you think just needs a little extra pop, you're just going to throw in a little bit of highlight. There's a lot of your artistic instincts are going to play a part into this. There we go. We have our fish, and I think he's good. I always recommend to artists to let your piece have some breathing time. Put it away for a day. Look at it again tomorrow. You might find some places that you just want to add a little something here or there. One thing you definitely want to do is to sign your painting. I always forget to do that part, but a signature if you'd like, a little date so you remember when you made it. As always, I love seeing what you create. Tag us in your social media posts at Cam Art at Home. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram. Subscribe, of course, to our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future videos. And speaking of future videos, I would love to hear some of your thoughts of things you'd like to see. So if there is an art medium or a topic that you'd like to see future videos or classes when we are able to do classes at the Art Museum, let me know in the comment section below. Once again, thanks for hanging out with the Coos Art Museum, and until our next video, stay creative. Bye-bye!